So Brad is finally here, and we can pretty much begin. And I just for people that aren't aware of the topic, I have in the description, but the topic is insulin. And what I did yesterday was I made a post and I said, and the reason I chose insulin is because we've had a lot of questions about it. Number one, it's come up a lot in the group recently, and number two, I think it's a very misunderstood hormone. I have surface level knowledge of it. Obviously, you have a much deeper knowledge and understanding of it. But I know that it's, it tends to get a bad reputation. A lot of people see it as like a bad thing, when really, like, if you're not producing insulin, you have a serious medical condition that needs to be addressed. So I thought we could go over it. We have a lot of good questions, like 50 questions here in the group that we got from my post. So
that's a lot. That's a lot of questions. Do we want to start with like a overview before we go directly into questions?
That's exactly what I wanted to do. And actually what I was kind of interested in is you could tell me, like, tell me if my overall, this is kind of how I would summarize it in for the layperson is what I really find interesting is the point that you make quite often about insulin. We typically, like for diabetics, for example, we typically think that it's a
You're muted. I cannot hear you.
There we go. Sorry, somebody was calling. It interrupted. We typically think of it as an inability to process carbs, right? But your whole point was that it's really an inability to metabolize fat. And I think, and this is where correct me if I'm wrong, but when the body when you gain weight, you gain fat. A lot of that fat can sort of spill over and get into the bloodstream, and it's the fat in your tissues that can interfere with cell signaling between the cells and insulin. Correct? I mean, I think that's kind of a big part of it. One of the parts of it.
So I think before we dive into that, I think we probably need to start like at the very basics.
Sure.
So I think, and then before we dive in, I'll just give people, I hate doing this, but I think it'll give people at least a decent understanding of where my perspective comes from. Yeah. So just a little bit of my background and what I spent most of my like scientific career working on. So my doctoral work, I worked in a lab where we focused primarily on understanding kind of the intersection between nutrition, specifically high-fat Western diets, exercise, and essentially insulin metabolism in diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So it gets really complicated from there, but like that's primarily what we focused on. So we spent a lot of time understanding like what are the molecular mechanisms surrounding insulin resistance, metabolism, exercise, how diet affects that in diabetes and in cardiovascular disease. My postdoc was in a very similar area, but it was focused more on glucose and protein metabolism and diabetes and kidney disease and how that relates to insulin resistance, inflammation, etc. And the same thing was my faculty position. So that's kind of primarily where I spent a lot of my time. And what we really tried to understand is like what actually drives insulin resistance? What is the disease process of insulin resistance? And then how does that actually work in terms of like how our body handles and processes nutrients and things like that. So when we actually think about like if we zoom out and we ask ourselves really the most fundamental question is what does insulin do? And it has a couple primary roles, and its real role is it kind of serves as a substrate conductor in your body. So basically its primary role is it gives your body the signal that, hey, I'm either in a fed state or a fasted state, and I have nutrients coming in that I need to send to the appropriate places, right? So insulin does a few things. One, it will tell your liver that you have glucose coming in, and so your liver doesn't need to start sending glucose out from your liver to your bloodstream to maintain normal blood sugar, right? So that's one of the primary ones. The second one is it tells your peripheral tissues, so like your muscle tissue, your organs, and your adipose tissue that, hey, I have glucose and protein coming in. We can start like storing some of these nutrients for future use. So we don't have to be burning all of them at this current time, right? So we're actually in like a state of acute substrate surplus. So that's insulin's primary role. And then when we get into the topic of insulin resistance, I think a lot of times we ascribe things that are going on in our bloodstream with insulin resistance, when in reality, outside of acute cases of like massive bacterial infection like sepsis, most insulin resistance is driven by things that are going on inside your cells, right? And so insulin resistance manifests like symptoms as high blood sugar, but in reality, there's a bunch of stuff going on inside your cells that's causing the insulin signal when it's received at the receptors of the cell to not translate all the way through, so your metabolic machinery in your cells is not working. So that's fundamentally what's happening. Now, what that actually means from like a metabolic perspective is very interesting. Right? We actually generally tend to think of, if you have insulin resistance, we primarily think of my body has an inability to metabolize carbohydrates. Yeah. And that's true in some sense, but like at the most fundamental sense, it's actually not quite true. So here's what actually happens. If we start inside your cells, when you have a state of insulin resistance, there's three things that primarily happen. One is, in insulin resistant cells, especially muscle cells, carbohydrate oxidation goes up.
Okay.
So the inside of your cells actually start burning more carbohydrates. Like, this is very well known, very well studied. You can actually like figure out exactly how much carbohydrate cells are burning, etc. So that's the first thing. The second thing is fat oxidation goes down. So the inside of your muscle cells actually start oxidizing less fat.
Yeah.
That then subsequently means your muscle tissue or your other peripheral tissues actually start storing more fats. When that happens, that fat storage, after a certain point, your body doesn't efficiently store the fats. It starts to store them as other things that are not like triglycerides, right? So they actually start storing them as things like diacylglycerols, ceramides, and other things that actually exacerbate insulin resistance. So then what happens is, outside your cells, your body starts absorbing less carbohydrates into those tissues. So now you basically have the situation where, okay, I'm oxidizing more carbohydrates in my cells. I'm not getting enough outside my cells. So I actually have to start increasing my fatty acid uptake, but then my fatty acid oxidation goes down. So you just get this cycle of like, things are not working very well. And what's really interesting is this like cellular mismatch between nutrients and what's going on, we can actually see very clearly in exercise data. So like, one of the most fundamental things that exercise physiologists do is they will basically measure what's called your RER, or your respiratory exchange ratio, which is a measure of how much carbohydrate your whole body is oxidizing versus fatty acids. And what's really interesting is, if you take a lean person, so somebody who doesn't have a high level of body fat and they're not insulin resistant, and you have them exercise at like 50% capacity, their body is burning primarily fats for fuel, right? It's something like 70% is from fat and 30% is from carbohydrate, like 50% effort. But if you take somebody who has insulin resistance, almost all of their energy for exercise is coming from carbohydrates and not fats. So we see at a cellular level and at a whole body level, it actually ends up being a fat oxidation problem, which then leads to the symptoms of excess carbohydrates in the blood, because you have an inability to deposit carbohydrates in your muscle tissue and your other peripheral tissues, and your liver is no longer getting the right signal to stop producing like glucose. So your hepatic glucose output, or your liver pumping glucose into your body, remains higher than it should. So I think like that's the most fundamental way to understand it. And I think as we answer questions, a lot of those things will make sense as we kind of go through that.
The exercise part is a pretty illustration of the overall point. Just what substrates these two groups of people burn. That's really interesting. So yeah, we can dive in. We have, like I said, we have quite a few, and a lot of them, a lot of good questions, a lot of relevant ones that a lot of people have asked at various times throughout the group. So hopefully those people that have asked these before, this will be helpful. So I'll just go right through the list. We'll kind of just scroll on down. So the first question I thought was kind of interesting, and I don't know how to answer this, so I'll be interested to hear what you say. But do as many people have insulin resistance as they would have you believe, right? In other words, do you think there's a lot of people that believe they're insulin resistant when they're really not? Is it a inflated problem?
I would actually say it's probably the opposite. I think a lot more people have insulin resistance than you would think. And it comes down to, I'm trying to think about the best way to explain this without a graph or a figure. So when we think about like the transition from being healthy to having like full-blown insulin resistance / type 2 diabetes, what's really interesting is your body massively compensates over time to make sure your blood sugar stays in a relatively normal level, right? So what's really interesting is you can actually have insulin resistance present and have normal blood sugar levels for years until your body gets to the point to where you can no longer produce enough insulin to overcome the insulin resistance to maintain normal blood sugars. So a lot of people are in the disease process of having insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, without actually knowing until they get the first glucose reading that's high. And at that point, it's been maybe months or years of that process ongoing. Now, I think what's buried in that question, and the actual question people are asking is, if I have a level of insulin resistance, does that fundamentally mean I need to adopt a substantially different diet? Like, do I need to have a low carb diet versus if I have no insulin resistance? And I think that's the real question probably buried behind that. And the answer is no, right? With the exception of some very specific cases, the data is pretty clear of low carb versus low fat diets in terms of what is the most beneficial for lowering blood glucose, reducing insulin resistance. They're fundamentally the same, right? And what actually, we can talk about this, I'm sure this is buried in some of your questions, is the root cause of most people's insulin resistance is, not everybody, but most people, is energy overload within your cells, right? So weight loss, even if it's 5-10%, generally is what drives most of the improvements we see. And so it's actually fairly diet archetype agnostic to what is the most effective. And in some cases, low carbohydrate, higher fat diets are actually less effective for overall metabolic improvements. You may see a slightly greater reduction in A1C. That's more of the reflection of the symptomology than the underlying etiology, but you'll actually see sometimes worse lipid panels during that transition process as you're losing weight. So that's sometimes how that manifests.
So the takeaway here, move more, essentially, right? Move more, eat less, reverse that energy balance, right? Start losing weight, exercise more, and that's going to take not take care of all of it, but would improve your condition, so to speak.
Yes, but I think there's a lot to be said about the benefits, the both short-term and longer-term benefits of ensuring you're regularly engaging in exercise while you're losing weight, because you get a couple things that happen. One is when you exercise, you get non-insulin dependent glucose uptake, right?
Mhm.
So if you think about it, like your insulin signaling is all jammed up in your cells, so that's not working. But when you exercise, you get glucose absorption into your peripheral tissues that has nothing to do with insulin being present.
Right.
So that's a benefit to, like, you get this acute benefit on glucose reduction. So total glucose load is lowered from exercise. The other thing you do is you free up acutely some of that like energy overload in that cell.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you get that. So it's basically like you get a temporary reduction inside these cells. The last piece is one of the contributory factors to intracellular insulin resistance is oxidative stress,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically within your cells. When you have energy overload, you get basically just like inefficient metabolism that produces more oxygen and free radicals than you would normally. Exercise enhances your body's intracellular and extracellular antioxidant systems. So you also get a reduction in that from exercise. So it's really important both in terms of like addressing the underlying energy balance issue, but also some of these others like symptoms that come from it that contribute to like this feed forward problem. Exercise actually helps address some of those things. So that's why the exercise component is incredibly important during the weight loss phase to kind of accelerate a lot of the benefits that you get.
So exercise, as always, equals good. So engage in regular exercise. Cool. So where are we at? Let's see. Let's take another one here. People talk about their insulin spiking when they eat, and it being a bad thing. Can you address that one? That's one of the big ones. Is eat this because your insulin spikes. It's kind of like, well, if your insulin doesn't increase, you might have a problem. So yeah, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So in a normal functioning body, glucose spikes and insulin spikes are normal, and they're part of just the feed fasted cycle, right? That is fundamentally just how your body works and actually what you need to be doing. Otherwise, you would just have very high levels of glucose in your blood for hours as these, like, either you're peeing your glucose out in your urine, or it's just taking time for the non-insulin mediated uptake to happen, whatever. So insulin is a normal part of just a normal functioning metabolism. And what's most interesting about this, just like this is where some of the cognitive dissonance, I think, and like logical missteps people make. So let's take the new GLP-1 drugs, right? Massive benefits for weight loss. That's not the topic of today, but like it works. It helps people lose weight. It helps them manage their blood sugars better. What do they fundamentally do? They cause greater insulin levels and greater insulin function, right? So people are like, oh, I'm not going to eat carbohydrates because they spike my insulin, but I'm going to take these drugs to help manage my sugar, and they just basically exacerbate my insulin more than the banana I ate. So I think it's tough because these systems can be complicated, and we try to boil them down to like these very simple ideas, but a lot of times it's like there's some internal inconsistencies of how we think about things until we really understand the like very fundamental aspects of how these things are working.
There's another question that says, I thought this one was good too. Do people gain anything from using a CGM if not diabetic? And my initial thought was, you can get, I suppose, if it's, if it's, you're getting a picture of maybe what certain foods do or how you might react to certain foods. If you can get a clearer picture of that, maybe that helps. But are there other, is that part of it? And are there other benefits to that?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. For people who have type 1 diabetes, CGMs are super beneficial, right? For people who are like very high level athletes and maybe really want to understand like how to best prepare for events, they can be super helpful. For people trying to like maybe for people who are really struggling with like energy levels throughout the day, people who are really struggling with like, hey, I get these really weird like hypoglycemic events, like understanding those things, those CGMs can be really helpful. And primarily because one of the most interesting things we've learned in the last 10 years is, this is probably like in all of nutrition science, I'd say is probably in the top 10 of most interesting things. Every person's body obviously is beholden to like thermodynamics, energy balance, etc. But like the acute effects in terms of blood glucose from individual foods has a lot more variance than we thought, right? So there was a paper published, must have been 2015, 16, 17. I can't remember the exact date. But if you feed 20 people the exact same high glycemic food, some people have almost no glycemic excursion, whereas other people's have massive glycemic excursion. So trying to understand like how your body specifically reacts to a banana, ice cream, bread, rice, pasta, for some people may be of interest. I've personally never used a CGM.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't provide you any good information for weight loss.
Right.
I'm at a point in my career where like I'm not trying to peak metabolically for one event every 4 years, like the Olympics right now. Go USA basketball. But like for me, it just doesn't provide a lot of utility. And I think for a lot of like normal people, I don't think they're going to provide a ton of like actual practical utility outside of those use cases. Now, they're interesting. We're collecting a ton of data. They're great research tools.
But for most people, it's probably Gen Pop, probably not going to benefit you a ton. This next one's good. Says this may be more of a medical question, but worth the ask. Does PCOS affect insulin or the other way around, or does it go both ways? Also, any information regarding PCOS with insulin resistance would be awesome.
Yeah, so this is an area that I would say is not my area of expertise, and there's probably people who have spent a lot more time on this than me. What I will say is PCOS definitely manifests in a state of insulin resistance for a lot of people.
That's interesting. That I didn't know that. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. The directionality and causality, I think, can be, from what I understand, is PCOS definitely causes insulin resistance. And I think, if I understand it correctly, is insulin resistance can kind of make the situation worse.
Yeah.
And, you know, it obviously comes down to the polycystic ovaries and the hormones and things like that. But what's really interesting from what I've seen is effectively the same concepts of like the exact nutrient profile of your diet, whether you're low carb or low fat, has very similar effects on overall like glucose metabolism, things like that. But there is a phenotype of women who do not have like the traditional energy overload insulin resistance, and it really comes down to these like hormonal things. And in that case, it becomes a little bit more of understanding the individual nature of how people are responding to foods.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more about symptom management than addressing underlying, like, it's not like you have in that phenotype, you don't have a weight problem, right? It's some of these other things that can contribute to the insulin resistance, and it becomes a little bit of like managing symptomology. This is why, like, so in women with PCOS, there's a supplement called myo-inositol, which is like a glucose analog, so to speak, that actually helps lower overall blood sugar, A1Cs, and improve insulin resistance among those women. But that supplement doesn't really work in people with type 2 diabetes, at least not to any meaningful degree. So it's a very interesting situation.
Cool. Okay. This one's probably a quick question and answer. Does eating within 4 hours of going to bed increase insulin resistance?
No. Not in most cases. There may be some situations like at the edge of the distribution, but no, not for most people.
Here's one. This is right up your alley. well, I mean, all these are up your alley, but this one specifically, it says, how exactly does insulin resistance show up on lab work?
So that's a really good question. Traditional lab work, like if you just go get a standard CMP, it's primarily going to show up in your fasting glucose. You're going to have elevated fasting glucose. The other way it shows up is if you would get insulin levels themselves in your metabolic panel, like in your lab work, you'll see actual like insulin, or what they call, sometimes they'll just take a C-peptide measure, which is, so the full insulin molecule gets processed down before it's like released into your body and utilized. And like the little cleaved off part called C-peptide is another proxy measure of insulin. That's one way you can, so you can directly measure insulin. That's probably a better measure of early insulin resistance than glucose. The gold standard way to measure it, this is not lab, like traditional labs where you get your blood drawn, but they have what's called insulin or glucose clamps, where basically they hook you up to an insulin drip and a glucose drip, and they like feed your body both of these things while controlling one, so they can actually measure the level of insulin resistance that you have in your body. That's like how we do it in research.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Which you can also do in grizzly bears.
Didn't know that. I was hoping to learn something new today. There it is.
I can tell you the amount of glucose that you have to flush through a grizzly bear to measure their insulin resistance is absurd.
I believe that. They're big animals.
Yeah.
So should I lost my spot. Let me go back. Okay. This this one was an interesting one for me too. I read in Lyle McDonald's women's book that birth control pills can cause insulin resistance. Can you confirm if this is true? And if so, what symptoms should I look out for? Do you know anything about that?
So here's what I would say. Lyle is right about 98% of things. So generally speaking, when he says something, it's most of the time true. I do know that birth control can lead to insulin resistance. The like prevalence of that, I don't know the exact prevalence data. I'd have to look that up because I don't know that number off the top of my head. I would imagine it's somewhere in the sub 10% range. It's probably sub 5%, but I do know it can. And how would you look out for it? I think you would probably just the same way anything else. It's like just get your labs done.
Yeah.
If you notice like you're having issues processing carbohydrates, or like your energy levels are way off, that's probably where you're going to get your initial like, oh, I should probably go get something looked at.
Okay. This one says, is fruit a poor choice for a pre-diabetic? And there's a second, which is, how about sugar-free candies? I'm a little more interested in what you have to say about the sugar-free candies, because I think that still can I think that can still have some effect, but what can you say about that?
Yeah, so I'd say fruit's totally fine.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is the history of like medicine is fascinating. Like if you have 20 years of your life to do nothing but read the diabetes research, it's really interesting. You guys probably see this is like the entire bound New England Journal of Medicine from like 82 to 2000.
Don't lie to me. When I was over at your house, I went through those. There aren't even pages in there. Those are just fake books.
No, I wish they weren't. Look.
Okay, well, cool. You got actual
functional
book.
Left ventricular aneurysm formation after acute anterior transmural myocardial infarction. That's what we flipped open to.
Okay,
so
they're real.
What's really interesting about the history of diabetes research, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm going to answer the question about fruit. Basically, up until the late 1990s, all of diabetes research was on type 1 diabetes. That's really the only type that we saw in like meaningful degrees, right? Then someone in the late 90s, early 2000s, some studies started coming out with people with type 2 diabetes. In that time frame and in kind of mid 1990s with some of the type 1, and in the late 90s, early 2000s, maybe as late as 2010-ish, they started doing research on fructose as a way to control glucose levels in people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes for a couple of reasons. One, when you consume fructose, you get no insulin spike, basically. Pure fructose. If you eat a piece of fruit, it also has glucose in it, etc. So you get some insulin spike. But when you consume just fructose, you get no real insulin spike. Maybe a tiny bit, but it's fairly negligible. And it's primarily because your body will convert some of the fructose to glucose. It's very small. The second piece of that is you get no glucose spike from consuming fructose. So there was this idea of, hey, if we just feed these people fructose instead of glucose for carbohydrates, like, we're good. We have no glucose spike. That was 10 years of wasted research, because it turns out, like, one, you can't just give people just fructose for carbohydrates for their whole life, because dietarily it just doesn't work. And two, well, it turns out the underlying cause of type 2 diabetes does not really have anything to do with the exact dietary carbohydrates you consume, but all the other things we talked about above. So fructose has been was massively studied in these populations for a decade. And so it turns out fruit's totally fine to consume, even early pre-diabetes, late diabetes, etc. Sugar-free candies, same thing as you're going to have lower glucose load, but that's not really addressing the actual issue of what's going on, right? We need to address the underlying insulin resistance. So plus, if you're consuming a lot of them, I don't know if when I was a kid, I got to experience this firsthand. A lot of the late 90s, early 2000s, diabetes candies that had sorbitol or xylitol cause a lot of GI upset for people. When I was a kid, one of our good family friends owned a health supplement food store. And one time I went in there and he's like, yeah, you can grab some candies from the candy bin. And so I grabbed 5 of those and I ate all 5 of them in the car at home. And I had the worst GI distress of all time. So I was a 7-year-old.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen on Amazon the reviews of people reviewing the sugar-free gummy bears. If you haven't.
Yeah, I have seen those.
That's quite the riot.
As another side tangent of that, there was a town where they were all super health conscious, and so they swapped out all of the hummingbird feeder sugar with sugar-free sugar, and all the hummingbirds died because they weren't getting any calories. It's very sad.
That is sad. Okay, let's see. This one says, so hypoglycemia and how it affects weight and weight regulation.
Hypoglycemia per se doesn't really have a meaningful effect on weight regulation. What will happen is, generally speaking, when people are hypoglycemic, they have those events or it happens regularly, it tends to drive people to consume more food because they want more carbohydrates to bring their glucose levels back to normal. And so sometimes they'll consume more calories, which then, causes that. So it's a little bit of this hey, it's more of a hunger, compensatory carbohydrate consumption than it is anything else.
This is actually something, this is a comment from a different person, but it touches on that. And this one says, I've been diagnosed with reactive hypoglycemia, and most days I can't keep my sugars up. I'd like a realistic diet to keep me even, but I'm only directed to dietitians who insist I eat carbs. My weight just bounces around and I'm always shaky and never feel well enough to exercise or stay in a calorie deficit. Suggestions would be awesome.
Yeah, so I would say, caveat, work with a physician, probably work with an endocrinologist. consider working with a dietitian. I would have to know a little bit more specifics about your specific situation, but I would say, one, you're probably someone who would benefit from having a continuous glucose monitor for a while and experimenting with different foods to see like what is happening. The other thing is the type of exercise you're doing. You may have to do either much lower intensity or much higher intensity exercise. It just kind of depends on how your body's responding. Like our bodies have some really interesting systems for maintaining glucose levels during exercise. So like one of the really fascinating things is when you start engaging in really high intensity exercise, your body preemptively starts dumping glucose from your liver into your blood because it knows it's going to need it, right? So before you need it, your body's like, oh, you're going to need some carbohydrates. So your body actually starts like, you get like the epinephrine dump, your liver starts dumping glucose into the bloodstream. So like when you start sprinting, like you get a spike and then it obviously comes back down as your body's taking it. So you probably would benefit from having like a CGM for a couple months and just like, hey, how does my body respond to this food? How does my body respond to this food? You may end up needing like maybe more fat in your diet. You may need to be a little bit more careful with not eating protein by itself because protein is insulinogenic, but right, so it actually can cause your body to have an insulin response because it has amino acids coming in that needs to do stuff with. But if you're not also consuming carbohydrates to compensate, you can get glucose level drops. So you probably would just benefit from having a CGM and working with like an endocrinologist and a dietitian to be like, hey, what can we do to figure out something that works for you?
I hope that's I hope that helps the poster of that. When you're exercising and your body needs glucose, that is, so we talk about non-insulin mediated glucose uptake. That only happens, well, I guess you can true or false. Does that only happen when you're exercising, or are there other times when the body does need insulin?
There's very few systems in our body that are on off, right? So generally speaking, the way I think about these things is like you probably have some very low level of basal non-insulin mediated uptake. But as you exercise, that's turned up, right? It's sort of like if you think about the three energy systems we have, like phosphagen system, glycolytic system, aerobic metabolism system. Like it's not like shifting gears in a car where you go from 1, 2, 3. It's like they're all contributing a little bit at a time, but like as you're placing more demand, the machinery gets turned on more or less in each one.
You're shifting how much in each one? Yeah.
Like the relative percentage and the absolute amount.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. We got one that's about the most. Well, let's go here. I got a better one because this one's I think important. Is can you become more insulin sensitive? Can you reverse this condition? I think one of the interesting ways that you put this, we were talking about this maybe a couple of years ago. This is how you put it to me, and I thought it was interesting, and I've kind of described it this way ever since. And that is, you said you don't really cure diabetes. It's like cancer. You put it into remission, so to speak, right? It's the remission term that you used. So is that how you say becoming more insulin sensitive and reversing, this condition is more of like a remission state?
So the answer to that question is a little bit interesting. The technically acceptable and appropriate term when somebody has type 2 diabetes and then no longer is diagnosed as that, like their A1C is now below the diagnostic level, their fasting glucose, we technically say it's in remission, right? It's not the same as having like cancer in remission, et cetera. I mean, they're very different processes and the way you need to think about them is different. But here's what I will tell people. From what we've learned is once you've developed type 2 diabetes, you lose body weight, your numbers go back to normal. you have less room for error before it comes back than the average person.
Okay.
Right. So it's remission in the sense that like you no longer are diagnosed, but you still have an elevated risk, and it's going to take less bad things to happen before the disease returns than if you were like healthy at baseline, right?
So you really need to be you really need to hone in on how you manage those things for the rest of your life.
Yes. Yeah. And what's really interesting is, I mean, I think part of it has to do with, especially if it's been around for a couple of years, like you've had type 2 diabetes for a few years, you have lost the full capacity of your insulin cells in your body, right? So like you probably maybe now only have 85% of your total beta cell function, right? So your like ability to max out the system is a little bit lower. So you can't compensate as much as you could before. Yep. We also see these weird things, like these quote unquote metabolic memory things, where like some of the things, the processes that happen during the initial disease progression, not all of them go away, right? So like your inflammatory processes are a little bit more higher tuned. Your like the switch of being insulin sensitive to insulin resistant, again, it's not binary, but like that progression happens a little bit quicker. So there's some of those things that you have to consider, but it's not technically, we call it remission. I wouldn't really call it remission. I wouldn't really call it cured either. It's kind of this weird in between state.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Here's another good one. This one says, so often on this page, the need for carbs is emphasized / carbs are not the enemy. How should one calculate carbs if their A1C falls in the pre-diabetic range? Is there a percentage to consider, or even total grams for the day? Or is that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we kind of fundamentally answered this question at the beginning of like how we understand the actual disease process, how the exact amount of dietary carbohydrates is not really driving disease process. It's not primarily dictating symptomology either. So I think we addressed that. I think in terms of like what the overall amount of carbohydrates you should have in a day if you're in the pre-diabetes range, I think it's one, dependent on what's your total calorie energy need, right? I would say most people, if we go by like percentages, 40 to 45, 50% of calories from carbohydrates for most people is probably relatively reasonable. I mean, that means a 2,000 calorie a day diet is, what would that be, like 200 grams of carbohydrates is probably roughly, right, 175 to 225 is probably in the normal range, and I think that's relatively normal for most people, right?
That'd be about, yeah, okay, that makes sense. About 40%, 800 calories, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. 40 to 50%. In terms of like 1.5 grams per pound is roughly like a good back of the hand measure. I mean, if you're in that range, right? So like a 150 pound person would be 175 grams. 200 pound person would be, right, 300 grams. That's probably a little bit high, but like that's roughly in the same ballpark.
Yeah, you get the point. Discuss the effects of menopause on A1C if you can.
No.
If no other change in diet have if no other changes in diet, I have exercised and lifted for 30 years and now added additional walking and exercise. A1C is climbing 5.4 to 5.7 in 6 months since becoming postmenopausal. Glucose stays in the same range for 15 years, and fasting insulin is 4.
Oh, so this is going to be an interesting answer, and this is highly contextual to what she is saying, and I may be way wrong on this, but I don't think I am. So what she's saying is her fasting glucose is staying the same, but her A1C is going up, and she's gone from like normal menstrual cycle to post menstrual cycle. This may just be a case of your red blood cells are lasting in your body a little bit longer than normal, and so they have a longer time to glycate. I will have to double check this.
Huh.
This is something we actually like. The rate of hemochromatosis in women goes up postmenopausal because they're no longer losing a substantial amount of their body, their blood every month, right? And so your A1C, what it is it is a measure of the quote unquote average glucose load over the last 90 days, right? That's affected by red blood cell turnover.
Yeah, that's
and so there's actually been studies where they've looked at like athletes who have much higher red blood cell turnover, like endurance athletes. They'll have artificially low A1Cs because their red blood cells are not around long enough to be exposed to the glycation process, etc. So this may just be, that's a small uptick. So this may be that. Obviously, some of the hormonal things can change a little bit of your insulin. So that may also be contributory. If you've gained a meaningful amount of body weight, that may also be contributing, but it also just may be like you're experiencing some change in red blood cell life and turnover. Yeah, I will have to look into that, but that was like an initial thought that came into my head.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I it's something I have never considered, or even I don't think I've even heard about that. So that's super interesting to me. Are you researching it right now?
Mm-hmm.
Let us know what you find out.
Yeah. This is current diabetes review, the influence of gender and menopausal status on HbA1c variation in a big data study of a Saudi population, blah, 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 blah. There was a statistically significant positive correlation between age and A1C levels, where for each 10 years increase in age, A1C increased by 0.35%. Overall, the mean A1C in women was significantly lower than men. However, women showed a significant increase in A1C with older age compared to men. Furthermore, the mean A1C levels in age group greater than 50 was significantly higher than that before age 50. The A1C increased by 1.18% in age 50 compared to those less than 50, and this increase in A1C was significantly higher in women compared to men. A1C levels are lower in women before the estimated menopausal age, which should be taken into consideration when using A1C for screening, diagnostic, and monitoring of diabetes in adult women. The short lifespan of red blood cells due to loss of blood through menstruation in women before menopause age is a possible reason for this variation. Boom.
Can you repeat the part about the things?
About what things?
Nothing. The Homer Simpson.
So yes, I think that was probably correct.
Good job, man. I didn't doubt you for what it's worth.
I doubt myself all the time. I get these ideas and then I have to like either see if I'm crazy or not.
It made sense to me.
But that's the problem, is things make sense and then the data doesn't support it. So you got to go double check.
This one's from one of our coaches, Brooke Orton.
No, I don't have cows.
We've kind of already answered this first part, but here's a two-parter question. So what is insulin resistance? Why does it matter? And is your blood sugar spiking, non-diabetic, a problem, or will it create problems long-term? I think, in other words, what she's asking is, it like, are these rapid and acute spikes in insulin, is that a cause for concern?
No, those don't cause insulin resistance. Generally speaking, you will see associations in the literature of like high glucose spikes with like poor health outcomes, but generally it's because, like, think about what your dietary pattern would have to look like for that to happen. It's like if you're mainlining,
right, yeah,
like Sour Patch Kids every meal, like it's probably more of a reflection of your overall lifestyle than it is the specific glucose excursion. And in fact, there's been some data that when they like tease that out, that does appear to be the case of they're not really substantially contributory.
Okay. This person said,
Here's another paper supporting my idea too. So just so you know.
This person says, what is the best / most effective way to lose weight and strength train when you have PCOS or possible metabolic dysregulated blood sugars / insulin? Coming from someone that struggles with high fasting blood sugars, yet low blood sugars during the day.
I would say that person and generally probably is going to benefit the most from a moderate protein, moderate carbohydrate, moderate fat diet. So you're not going like extreme in either direction. Getting a lot of walking and doing some weightlifting is going to be probably the best approach. I would probably try to minimize like a lot of like super intense HIIT style training. What your goal right now is, let's get a moderate energy deficit. Let's increase our general physical activity throughout the day to promote some of this like non-insulin mediated glucose uptake. Let's focus on building a greater metabolic sink in your muscle tissue. Those would be what I would focus on.
Cool. I have I think we've covered some of them were kind of repeats of the same question. So I didn't go through all of them, but I think we've covered most of the unique questions. There is one that says, lab results, what is optimal insulin ranges? Not just, no, sorry. Lab results, what is optimal insulin, not just cookie cutter ranges? Or is it really, would it be a range?
I mean, it's been so long since I've looked at reference ranges. So I want to say it is, you're going to have to bear with me while I look this up. Fasting insulin, I think normal is between like 5 and 12 or 5 and 15. It's kind of the unit. Now, a couple caveats to that. One, everybody's different, right? So like what's optimal for my insulin levels and your insulin levels are going to be slightly different. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is I have a growing concern with what we're using as reference ranges as we update them, because updated data is based on normative data. Our entire population is changing. Our entire population on average has a much higher BMI, which suggests a higher level of insulin resistance. So I would aim, there's certain things that I would really worry about in my metabolic panel. I would want my insulin levels on the lower end of the reference range. Like if I was going for, in my head, what's ideal or optimal, but generally speaking, that 5 to 12 range is probably where it's going to fall if you're metabolically healthy.
Okay, perfect. I think just one left here. Oh, by the way, we did get a suggestion. At the next topic, can the next topic be menopause and estrogen? Just kidding, but no, really. So that's what somebody wants us to discuss next time. So maybe just putting it up. Menopause and estrogen seems to be a popular one. So, but as far as questions, yeah, I pretty much just have one left here, and this one says, does carb cycling help regain metabolic flexibility? If so, can it be just let the carbs roll some days and not others, or does one have to be more intentional, more 1 day a week, only on big workout days, every third day, high low, high medium low? Help. I know NEAT is bigger level probably, but I am not good at moving. So I think what she's asking is, overall, does carb cycling help? Does it have any effect on her goals?
If I recall correctly from the literature, periodizing your macronutrients, having higher fat, lower fat, higher carb, lower carb days can improve your metabolic flexibility to some extent. But in my opinion, it's relatively low on the order of priority, right? The best things you can do to improve your metabolic flexibility, like your body's true ability to switch when it needs to from carbohydrate to fat metabolism and back, is one, get to a normal-ish BMI and have like very minimal levels of insulin resistance. 2, stretch your exercise capacity. So like do some high intensity training, do some long duration, like low intensity training. Like you need to stretch those metabolic systems. Your body builds the machinery you use.
Yeah.
So when you do high intensity work, you literally create more of the enzymes that your body uses to metabolize carbohydrates. When you do fatty acid, heavy exercise, you literally build the molecular machinery to metabolize those. So that's the second thing. Then third, once you've like dialed those in, then maybe the like periodization might benefit. How structured that needs to be, honestly, it'd be like, I'm gonna eat higher carb today and maybe lower carb tomorrow. Like that's probably, unless you're like have everything else dialed in, that's probably the extent of how detailed you need to get.
Get the basics down first. In other words, don't worry necessarily about some of the nuances of that.
Don't major in the minors, boys and girls.
That's all the questions, man, that we got through them. And I think this was very beneficial for people. I enjoyed talking about it, hearing your answers, and really I think they were excited for this one. So
I'm glad people got to hear me come up with a crazy idea on the fly too.
That was the cherry on top. We are going to
wrap this up beside the 10 o'clock meeting, and I still need a biology break before my next meeting.
11:59. All right. Well, if you got to sign off, I will sign off as well. But let me just say a huge thank you to everyone for watching and for all the questions, and thank you, Brad, for joining us. And we'll do the next one soon. We have another topic prepped, so we'll see you guys soon.
If questions are asked in here that we didn't get to, Dylan, like in this live stream, would you compile them and then I can try to address them later? Because I think there was a couple questions on type 1 and a couple other ones that we didn't get to. So we'll answer those as well.
Yeah, that's no problem. Cool. All right, guys, we're out of here.